They had until 4 o'clock, or so the consensus held. The party of 11 had departed Crested Butte, Colorado, on the morning of January 19, 1884, bound for the mining camp at Gothic, 7 miles north through the Elk Mountains. It was a Saturday. The sky was clear. Several members of the group had made the journey before, and no one expressed concern about the distance or the cold. The temperature at departure was noted in a later affidavit as brisk but tolerable. One witness recalled that the group seemed in fine spirits, laughing as they set out. They were not prospectors or drifters. They were clerks, merchants, a school teacher, a telegraph operator's wife. Most had lived in Crested Butte for less than a year, drawn by the silver boom and the promise of steady wages. Gothic, though smaller, had hosted a dance the night before, and the group had been invited to attend a Sunday social the following day. The journey was described in a letter written 3 days earlier as a pleasant outing, weather permitting. Weather permitted. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the group passed the halfway marker, a lightning-struck pine that served as a landmark along the trail. A rancher named Hollis Tremaine, hauling firewood in the opposite direction, encountered them there. He would later testify that they were moving at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to adjust their packs and converse. He advised them that snow was expected by evening, but not before nightfall. They thanked me, he recalled, and continued on without haste. By 10:15, they had crossed Russell Gulch and entered the stretch of trail that ran parallel to the East River. Here the path narrowed, hemmed in by spruce and granite outcroppings. A journal entry by one of the party members, recovered months later, noted the beauty of the ice formations along the riverbank. Like glass chandeliers, it read. We stopped to admire them. They arrived in Gothic shortly after noon. The town, such as it was, consisted of 24 structures, cabins, a general store, a mill office, and a saloon that doubled as a meeting hall. The population in winter rarely exceeded 40. The group was welcomed warmly. Hot coffee was prepared. Several members accepted invitations to rest indoors before beginning the return trip. A storekeeper named Amos Fitch later testified that he urged them to stay the night. The clouds were thickening, he said. I told them there was no shame in waiting till morning. They declined. At approximately 1:45, the group reassembled near the mill office. A brief discussion was held regarding the advisability of departure. The school teacher, a woman named Catherine Dorsey, suggested they delay until Sunday. She was overruled. The consensus, as reconstructed from multiple testimonies, was that the weather, while deteriorating, remained navigable. One man, a clerk named Samuel Oakes, was recorded as saying, "We've walked through worse." At 2 o'clock, they began the return journey. By 2:30, the first flakes had begun to fall. A mill worker named Jacob Lind watched them depart from the doorway of the saloon. He would later state that they were not moving quickly, but neither did they appear alarmed. They walked like people who believed they had time, he said. The last documented sighting occurred at approximately 3 o'clock, near the lightning-struck pine. A trapper named Emil Korsak, returning to Gothic with a pair of snowshoes slung over his shoulder, passed the group on the trail. He noted that the snow was falling steadily, but had not yet begun to accumulate in earnest. He exchanged pleasantries with 2 of the men. One asked him how far it was to Crested Butte. "An hour and a half at a good pace," Korsak replied. "Maybe 2, given the conditions." He later recalled that no one seemed distressed. At 3:15, the wind picked up. By 3:45, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet. At 4 o'clock, the hour by which they had expected to be safely home, the group was still on the trail, somewhere between the Pine and Russell Gulch. No one in Crested Butte had yet realized they were overdue. No alarm had been raised. The storm, which would later be described in meteorological records as an unseasonable Alberta clipper, intensified rapidly. Snow fell at a rate of 2 inches per hour. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 30 minutes. A ledger entry from the Crested Butte General Store, dated January 20th, 1884, contains a single notation in the margin, written in pencil. "Party of 11 expected yesterday afternoon. Not arrived. The search began at dawn on Sunday. By then, the storm had deposited 14 inches of new snow. The trail was obliterated. Searchers found no tracks, no abandoned belongings, no clear indication of where the group had been when conditions became untenable. A rescue party of 18 men worked through the day and into Monday, probing drifts and calling out names. They found nothing. On Tuesday, January 22nd, a second storm struck. The search was suspended. In a letter to the territorial governor dated January 28th, the Crested Butte town marshal wrote, "We believe they turned back toward Gothic when the storm worsened, but were unable to reach it, or they continued toward Crested Butte and were overtaken. We cannot say which. The cold was such that exposure for more than an hour would have been fatal." A notation in the Gothic mill log, dated January 19th, 1884, recorded the time of the group's departure and added a single line. They could have stayed. They were offered shelter. They chose to leave. The decision to return was not reckless. This must be understood. In the months following the disappearance, much attention was devoted to the question of culpability. Newspaper editorials debated the wisdom of the journey. Letters to the editor speculated on misjudgment, overconfidence, or inexperience. The impulse to assign blame is natural when the outcome is so absolute. But the evidence suggests that the group did not act foolishly. They acted reasonably within the framework of information available to them. The weather on the morning of January 19th had been clear. The forecast, such as it existed in 1884, called for snow in the evening but not before dusk. Multiple witnesses confirmed this. The sky, though overcast by midday, did not present immediate cause for alarm. Hollis Tremaine, the rancher who encountered the group at the halfway point, later stated that he himself had continued his work that afternoon without concern. "It looked like weather," he said, "but not like a storm." The group had also received assurances from local residents. Amos Fitch, the storekeeper in Gothic, did advise them to stay, but his warning was framed as a precaution, not a directive. "I didn't say they'd die if they left," he testified. "I said it might be wise to wait. There's a difference." Jacob Lind, the mill worker, echoed this sentiment. "They asked if the trail was passable, and I said it was. It was passable when they left." The distance was short, 7 miles. Under normal conditions, a healthy adult could cover the route in under 2 hours. The group had covered the outbound journey in less than 3, including stops. There was no reason to believe the return would be significantly slower. Even accounting for snow, they had ample time to reach Crested Butte before dark. Dusk in January fell around 5:30. They departed Gothic at 2 o'clock. The arithmetic was sound. Moreover, the trail was familiar. 3 members of the group had walked it before. Samuel Oakes, the clerk, had made the trip twice in the previous month. Catherine Dorsey, the schoolteacher, had traveled to Gothic in December to deliver textbooks to a mining family. A man named Peter Harkin, a carpenter, had lived in Gothic the previous winter and knew the route intimately. These were not strangers stumbling through unknown terrain. They had knowledge. They had experience. They had each other. The social context also bears examination. To remain in Gothic overnight would have required imposing on the hospitality of a small, resource-strapped community. The town had limited provisions and fewer accommodations. While Amos Fitch and others extended invitations, the group may have hesitated to burden their hosts. A letter written by a Crested Butte resident in February 1884 noted that, "It is not the custom here to presume upon generosity, even when offered." The group may have believed that accepting shelter would have been seen as an overreaction, or worse, an insult to their own competence. There was also the matter of employment. Several members of the party were expected at work on Monday morning. Samuel Oakes kept the books for a silver assayer and had a ledger deadline. The telegraph operator's wife, a woman named Ellen Marsh, had promised to assist with Sunday services at the Methodist chapel. Peter Harkin was overseeing the construction of a new schoolhouse and had materials arriving by freight on Monday. These were not idle individuals. They had obligations. They had routines. The idea of remaining in Gothic for an indefinite period, Perhaps several days, if the storm proved persistent, was not merely inconvenient. It was irresponsible. And so, they walked. The rhythm of their departure was unhurried. Testimonies describe a group moving with purpose, but without panic. They distributed weight evenly among the packs. They checked their boots and adjusted their scarves. Someone made a joke, "The content is lost," and several people laughed. Emil Korsak, the trapper, recalled that when he passed them at 3 o'clock, they were still conversing amiably. "They did not look like people in danger," he said. The snow, when it began, was gentle. Flakes drifted down in soft spirals, catching on wool and melting against warm skin. It was the kind of snow that invites nostalgia, not fear. One of the party members, identity unknown, was said to have remarked that it looked like a scene from a Christmas card. This detail appears in a second-hand account recorded by a Gothic resident who claimed to have overheard the comment as the group departed. Whether accurate or apocryphal, it captures the prevailing mood. Calm, almost celebratory. By the time the wind shifted and the temperature plummeted, the group was already committed. To turn back would have meant retracing 2 miles of trail, uphill, into the teeth of the storm. To continue forward meant pressing on toward Crested Butte, where warmth and shelter awaited, if they could reach it. The decision, when framed this way, was not irrational. They were closer to their destination than to their starting point. Logic suggested they continue. What they did not know, what no one could have known, was that the storm would intensify so rapidly. The Alberta Clipper, a meteorological phenomenon characterized by fast-moving cold fronts and sudden snowfall, was poorly understood in the 1880s. There were no weather stations in the Elk Mountains, no telegraphed warnings, no instruments to measure barometric pressure or wind speed. The group had only their senses, and their senses told them they had time. In the weeks following the disappearance, a reporter from the Denver Tribune interviewed several Gothic residents. One man, a miner named Ulrich Brenner, offered a statement that was widely reprinted. They were not fools, they were not careless, they were ordinary people who made an ordinary decision. The storm was the thing that was extraordinary. The coroner's inquest, convened in March after the thaw revealed the first remains, reached no conclusion regarding fault. The official finding read, "Death by exposure to cold. No evidence of recklessness or negligence. Weather conditions exceeded reasonable expectation." The group had not been warned loudly enough. They had not been frightened enough. They had not felt the danger in time, and so they walked. The point of no return cannot be identified with precision. There was no single instant when survival became impossible, no clear threshold beyond which every step led irreversibly toward death. The transformation was gradual, almost polite. The cold deepened by degrees. The snow thickened incrementally. Visibility diminished in slow erosion. By the time the group understood that they were in peril, the options available to them had already narrowed to a vanishing set. The last confirmed sighting occurred at 3 o'clock, near the lightning-struck pine. Emil Korsak, the trapper, passed them heading in the opposite direction. He noted that the snow was falling steadily, but had not yet begun to accumulate. The group was still moving forward. They were still talking. One man asked about the distance to Crested Butte. Korsak answered honestly, 1.5 hours, perhaps 2. No one argued. No one suggested retreat. This is the moment that haunts the historical record. Korsak, in his later testimony, expressed profound regret. "I should have told them to turn back," he said. "I should have insisted." But what basis would he have had for such insistence? The snow was falling, yes, but it was not yet a blizzard. The wind was picking up, but it had not yet reached gale force. The temperature was dropping, but it remained within the range of tolerability. Korsak himself continued on to Gothic without incident. He arrived safely, warmed himself by the stove in the saloon, and thought nothing more of the encounter until the following day. The group, meanwhile, pressed on. Between 3 o'clock and 3:30, the storm began to change character. The snow, which had been light and intermittent, became heavy and relentless. The wind shifted from the northwest, funneling down the valley with accelerating force. Visibility, which had been limited but manageable, collapsed. The trail, which had been visible as a faint depression in the snow, disappeared entirely. At some point during this half-hour window, the group must have paused to assess their situation. There is no record of this pause, no diary entry or testimony to confirm it, but logic and human nature suggest it occurred. 11 people, caught in rapidly worsening conditions, would have stopped to confer. They would have debated their options. They would have weighed the risks of continuing forward against the risks of turning back, and they would have reached a conclusion. What that conclusion was, we can only infer. The absence of remains near the lightning-struck pine suggests they did not turn back. The absence of remains near Gothic suggests they did not reach it. The distribution of the bodies, when they were eventually recovered, indicates that the group remained together for some time before fragmenting. This suggests cohesion, at least initially. They made a collective decision and acted on it. The most likely scenario, reconstructed from the evidence, is that they continued forward. They believed or hoped that Crested Butte was closer than Gothic. They believed or hoped that the storm would abate. They believed or hoped that they could outlast the worst of it and reach safety before nightfall. They were wrong on all counts. By 4 o'clock, the temperature had dropped below zero. The wind was gusting at speeds later estimated at 30 to 40 miles per hour. The snow was falling at a rate that would bury the trail beneath a foot of powder within 2 hours. The group, if they were still moving, would have been walking blind, guided only by instinct and the vague memory of the path they had followed that morning. At some point, perhaps around 4:30, they would have realized they were lost. This realization would not have come suddenly. There would have been no single moment of clarity, no dramatic revelation. Instead, there would have been a slow accumulation of doubts. A missed landmark, a turn that felt unfamiliar, a stretch of trail that seemed too long or too steep. Someone would have voiced concern. Someone else would have offered reassurance. They would have kept walking because walking was the only option. By 5 o'clock it would have been dark. Not the gentle darkness of dusk, but the absolute blackness of a mountain valley in a snowstorm. The group would have been unable to see more than a few feet ahead. They would have been unable to distinguish the trail from the surrounding forest. They would have been cold, not hypothermic yet, but beginning to feel the first creeping numbness in their fingers and toes. At this point, survival depended on finding shelter. A hollow beneath a fallen tree, an overhanging rock, a dense thicket of spruce that might block the wind. Anything that could provide even minimal protection from the elements. The group, according to later analysis, did attempt to find such shelter. 3 of the 11 bodies were discovered clustered beneath a granite outcropping, suggesting they had tried to huddle together for warmth. 2 others were found near a deadfall, partially buried in snow, as though they had attempted to construct a windbreak. But these efforts were insufficient. The cold was too severe, the wind was too strong. The snow, accumulating at 2 inches per hour, buried everything. By 6 o'clock, the group would have been in the advanced stages of hypothermia. Their core temperatures would have dropped below 95 degrees. Their thinking would have become sluggish, their movements uncoordinated. Some would have begun to experience paradoxical undressing, the irrational removal of clothing that occurs in the late stages of cold exposure. Several of the recovered bodies were found partially unclothed, their coats and scarves discarded in the snow. By 7 o'clock, most would have been unconscious. By 8 o'clock, all would have been dead. The window in which they could have saved themselves closed somewhere between 3 and 4 o'clock. If they had turned back at 3:15, when the snow first began to fall heavily, they might have reached Gothic before visibility collapsed. If they had stopped at 3:30 and sought shelter immediately, they might have survived the night. If they had been willing to abandon the trail and burrow into the snow, constructing a makeshift snow cave, they might have insulated themselves enough to endure until morning. But they did none of these things. They continued forward because forward was the direction they had chosen. They kept walking because walking felt like action, and action felt like control. They believed, until it was too late to believe otherwise, that they would make it. A notation in the Journal of Catherine Dorsey, recovered with her body in May 1884, offers a final glimpse into the group's state of mind. The entry, dated January 19th, was written in pencil, the handwriting shaky but legible. It reads, "Snow heavier now. We have decided to press on. Crested Butte cannot be far." The next page is blank. The bodies were not found quickly. The first discovery occurred on March 12, 1884, nearly 2 months after the disappearance. A rancher named Thomas Wickham, riding the high trail above Russell Gulch, noticed a dark shape protruding from a snowbank. Upon investigation, he found the body of a man later identified as Peter Harkin, the carpenter. Harkin's body was partially frozen, preserved by the cold. His coat was missing. His hands were bare. A coroner's examination revealed no injuries beyond those consistent with hypothermia and frostbite. The location was approximately 3.5 miles from Gothic, less than halfway to Crested Butte. Over the following weeks, as the snow melted, additional bodies were located. 2 were found together beneath a granite outcropping, less than a quarter mile from where Harkin had been discovered. 3 more were found scattered along a half-mile stretch of what was believed to be the trail. The body of Catherine Dorsey was discovered nearly a mile south of the others, suggesting she had become separated from the group. Her journal, found in her coat pocket, was waterlogged but partially legible. The final 2 bodies were not recovered until May. They were found together, seated side by side against the trunk of a spruce tree, their arms linked. One was identified as Ellen Marsh, the telegraph operator's wife. The other was Samuel Oakes, the clerk. Both were fully clothed. Both appeared, in the words of the recovery team, as though they had simply sat down to rest and never risen. The total distance covered by the group, measured from the point of their last confirmed sighting to the farthest body, was less than 4 miles. In the weeks following the recovery, an inquest was held in Crested Butte. Testimonies were taken from everyone who had encountered the group on January 19th. Maps were drawn. Weather records were consulted. A timeline was constructed, charting the group's movements from departure to presumed death. The goal was not to assign blame, but to understand. What emerged was a portrait of reasonable decisions made under conditions that became unreasonable. Hollis Tremaine, the rancher, testified that he had seen no cause for alarm when he met the group at the halfway point. They were in good spirits, he said. The weather was fair. I told them snow was expected, but not until evening. That was the truth, as I understood it. Amos Fitch, the storekeeper in Gothic, confirmed that he had advised the group to stay overnight, but framed his warning as optional. I did not tell them they would die if they left, he repeated. I told them it would be safer to wait. There's a difference. Emil Corsack, the trapper, expressed the deepest regret. I passed them at 3 o'clock, he said. They asked how far to Crested Butte, and I told them an hour and a half, maybe 2. I should have told them to turn back. I should have walked them back to Gothic myself, but I didn't see the danger. The snow was falling, but it wasn't a blizzard yet. I thought they had time. The meteorological analysis, compiled months later, confirmed that the storm had intensified with unusual speed. A report submitted to the Territorial Weather Bureau noted, the Alberta Clipper of January 19, 1884, exhibited characteristics consistent with rapid cyclogenesis. Wind speeds increased from 10 miles per hour at 2 o'clock to 40 miles per hour by 4 o'clock. Snowfall rates exceeded 2 inches per hour. Temperature dropped 23 degrees in 90 minutes. Such conditions are rare, but not unprecedented in the Elk Mountains. The inquest reached no formal conclusion regarding fault. The final report, dated April 3, 1884, stated, "The deceased perished due to exposure to severe weather. No evidence suggests recklessness or criminal negligence. The decision to depart Gothic on the afternoon of January 19th was made in good faith, based on reasonable assessment of conditions at the time. But the question remained, what should they have done? Hindsight offers clarity that was unavailable in the moment. The group should have stayed in Gothic. They should have accepted Amos Fitch's invitation, imposed on his hospitality, missed their Monday obligations, and waited for the storm to pass. They should have prioritized survival over courtesy, over routine, over the mild inconvenience of delay. Or, failing that, they should have turned back at 3 o'clock when the snow first began to fall heavily. They should have retraced their steps to Gothic, uphill, into the wind, and arrived cold and exhausted but alive. Or, failing that, they should have stopped at 3:30 and sought immediate shelter. They should have abandoned the trail, dug into the snow, huddled together, and endured the night. They would have suffered. Some might have lost fingers or toes to frostbite, but they would have lived. But they did none of these things, because none of these things felt necessary at the time. A letter to the editor, published in the Gunnison News-Democrat on April 15, 1884, captured the sentiment of many in the region. We look upon the tragedy at Gothic and ask ourselves, what would I have done? And we realize with humility that we likely would have done the same. The group did not act foolishly. They acted as any of us would have acted. They believed they had time. We would have believed it too. The bodies were buried in the Crested Butte cemetery in a shared plot. A single marker was erected, listing all 11 names. Beneath the names, an inscription was carved. Gone in the storm of January 19, 1884. They walked in faith. No mention was made of hesitation, of delay, of the quiet moments when they might have turned back and chose not to. Those details were left to the archives. The Gothic tragedy, as it came to be known, faded from public memory within a generation. Newspapers moved on to other disasters. The silver boom that had drawn the group to Colorado collapsed in the 1890s, and the mining camps that dotted the Elk Mountains were abandoned. Gothic itself became a ghost town, its buildings left to rot in the alpine sun. Crested Butte survived, but the story of the 11 who disappeared became a footnote, a cautionary tale invoked occasionally by old-timers, but largely forgotten by the wider world. The historical record, however, preserves the details with dispassionate precision. The testimonies, the weather reports, the coroner's findings, the recovered journal entries, all remain archived in the Gunnison County Courthouse, available for review by anyone curious enough to request them. The files are thin, the paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the information is intact. What emerges from these records is not a story of dramatic error or spectacular misjudgment, but of incremental miscalculation. The group did not make one catastrophic decision. They made a series of small, reasonable choices, each of which seemed justified in the moment, but which together led them into a situation from which there was no escape. They chose to leave Gothic at 2 o'clock, because the weather, while deteriorating, had not yet turned dangerous. They chose to continue forward at 3 o'clock, because turning back seemed more difficult than pressing on. They chose to keep walking at 3:30, because stopping felt like giving up. Each choice viewed in isolation was defensible, but the cumulative effect was fatal. This is the nature of tragedies of this kind. They do not announce themselves with thunder or fire. They creep forward in whispers, in hesitations, in the slow erosion of options. By the time the danger is undeniable, the moment to act has already passed. The Gothic group had time to save themselves. They had multiple opportunities to turn back, to seek shelter, to make a different choice. But they didn't recognize those opportunities as critical. They felt like minor inconveniences, not life or death decisions. And so the opportunities slipped away, quietly, without ceremony, leaving only the cold and the snow and the 11 bodies scattered across 4 miles of mountain trail. Modern search and rescue protocols emphasize early intervention. Turn back at the first sign of trouble. Do not wait for conditions to become severe. Do not assume you have more time than you do. These principles are drawn, in part, from cases like Gothic, where delay proved fatal, not because the victims were incompetent, but because they were human. They rationalized, they hoped, they believed in their own resilience. They were wrong, but they were not foolish. The marker in the Crested Butte cemetery still stands, though the inscription has weathered over the decades. Visitors occasionally stop to read the names, to wonder about the people who walked into a storm and never returned. Some leave flowers, some take photographs. Most move on quickly, their attention drawn to more recent graves, more immediate concerns. The archives remain. In the end, what the Gothic tragedy reveals is not a failure of character or competence, but a failure of perception. The group did not see the danger in time, not because they were blind, but because the danger did not yet look like danger. It looked like weather. It looked like inconvenience. It looked like something that could be managed, endured, walked through. By the time it looked like death, they were already dying. No one forced them. They went voluntarily. They walked out of Gothic at 2 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. 11 people in good health and reasonable spirits, believing they had time to reach Crested Butte before dark. They were offered shelter and declined. They were warned of snow and continued anyway. They made choices that seemed, in the moment, entirely rational, and they were never seen alive again. The lesson, if there is one, is not that they should have known better. It is that knowing better requires seeing the future, and the future is always obscured. We make our decisions with the information we have, in the time we have, and hope that we have judged correctly. Usually, we do. Sometimes, we do not. The Gothic group did not. The snow fell. The wind rose, the temperature dropped, and 11 people who believed they had time discovered they did not. Nothing dramatic happened. No avalanche, no fall, no violent end. Just cold and snow, and the slow realization that the trail home had disappeared. They walked until they could walk no further. Then they stopped. Then they sat. Then they lay down, and the snow covered them quietly without malice, until spring came and revealed what winter had taken. The archives note the date of the last entry in Catherine Dorsey's journal, January 19th, 1884. The archives note the distance between the last confirmed sighting and the first recovered body, 3.5 miles. The archives note the cause of death, exposure to cold. The archives do not note what the 11 thought in their final hours, whether they regretted their decision to leave Gothic, whether they blamed themselves or the weather or simple bad luck. Those thoughts are lost. Only the facts remain. 11 people walked into a storm. 11 people died. Nothing forced them. They went voluntarily. They believed they had time. They were wrong.